Recently, the global critic score gave the video game Crimson Desert an average of 78 out of 100 on Metacritic, the usual aggregation site for scores across almost any medium, from music to film. The impact was so significant that the company's stock dropped by 30%. But here's the interesting part. They've sold over 6 million units, and 86% of the reviews on Steam are positive, 86% out of more than 46,000. Shortly after, the stock went back up and the company recovered. But it got me thinking, what is the role of criticism in art? Back in 1917, Marcel Duchamp placed a urinal in an exhibition. A large part of the critics basically laughed at it, while others praised it as if it were the second coming of Christ. Logically, if you think about it more than 2 seconds, it would be completely absurd to go see it. Who would recommend that? The whole point of the piece is to mock the art world itself. But in the end, I like to think criticism has always existed to figure out whether something is worth spending time and money on something that wants to be experienced. But what the hell is a critic anyway? I mean, what do they have that the public doesn't? Well, you could argue that someone dedicated exclusively to evaluating an art form would have more experience and knowledge. And sometimes that's true, right? For example, in our case, you'd expect a video game journalist to have at least a decent level of skill, maybe across a couple of genres, along with a long history of games played and even some broader knowledge of culture and the humanities. But we've seen time and time again that this isn't always the case. Like that controversy with a journalist who couldn't even get past the tutorial in Cuphead, something any kid could beat. Let's talk about cases where critic scores just don't make sense to me. Recently, A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, a Game of Thrones prequel, felt like the best show I've seen since Better Call Saul. The penultimate episode of season 1 is one of my favorites ever. What does Metacritic give it? A 74. Remnant 2 is to me the most important shooter of the decade. It completely shifts how cover and boss design work in the genre. What does it have? An 80 on Metacritic. And here's another example from a much smaller studio. Wanted Dead, a game I played recently that brilliantly blends melee combat with gunplay, with hilarious dialogue that feels straight out of 90s Tarantino. A 54. It barely sold. I don't even know how the company is still standing. And the opposite happens to take Dragon Age The Veilguard, a fantasy RPG whose earlier entries drew heavily from classic role-playing like Dungeons and Dragons and Tolkien. An 82 on Metacritic, yet with characters speaking like modern day people, a colorful art direction that clashes with the darker tone of the previous entries, and passable gameplay that barely even fits the series' usual genre. I've also got a more controversial example. Resident Evil 9 has an 89, and yes, it's a very good game. I had a great time with it. But I'd argue that by switching between two completely different genres, horror and action, it never quite nails the progression or difficulty of either. It never really scales properly, so I don't think it quite deserves that near perfect score. And that leads us to something pretty clear. Numerical scores, by themselves, don't say much. There's a massive amount of nuance and detail involved when talking about anything, and you simply can't reduce that to a number. Imagine spending years building something only to be met with a number. What would you even do with that? And nothing. You can do anything with it. What matters as feedback is the details, the nuance. On top of that, there's the financial weight criticism carries in whether entertainment companies can keep going. Scores, influence deals with publishers, and all that. You might think opinions are just opinions, something we can't ignore, but the truth is, whether our favorite artists get to keep creating often depends on them. A well-known case is Fallout New Vegas. The studio had a deal to receive a bonus if the game scored above 85 on Metacritic, but it landed at 84. And the most painful part is that it later became a classic RPG beloved by basically everyone. One of the most influential games in the genre, no less. So, going back to the original question. We need criticism for a simple reason. There's too much entertainment, too much art nowadays. It's hard to choose what to spend our limited time and money on. But mainstream corporate criticism, the usual outlets, often doesn't work. That's why I try to find specific YouTubers or journalists who I know actually understand a topic and I follow them. But not everyone has the time for that, and not everyone shares the exact same tastes. It's difficult and it takes effort. Effort a lot of people just can't afford to spend. And that's how the mainstream critics sustain themselves. And also why they fear independent critics on YouTube and similar platforms. You can support me on coffee.com/LeonCCA, link in the description. So maybe I can actually afford Crimson Desert because this month, no joke, I'm literally in the red. I'll leave you with a video about why AI isn't going to rebel. And well, this is YouTube. If you like the video, you know what to do.